Hello. I'm so excited to share that I'll be visiting Kalaalleq, Greenland, next weekend. I'm particularly thrilled to visit during our national dog sled race, which our country is proud to support as a sponsor. I've been reading all about it with my children, and I'm amazed by the incredible skill and teamwork that it takes to participate in this race. I'm also coming to celebrate the long history of mutual respect and cooperation between our nations, and to express hope that our relationship will only grow stronger in the coming years. I look forward to meeting many of you soon, and to learning from you about your beautiful land, culture, and traditions. See you soon.
What is your vision for the potential annexation of Greenland and getting them potentially to
Well, I think it'll happen, and I'm just thinking, I didn't give it much thought before, but I'm sitting with a man that could be very instrumental. You know, Mark, we need that for international security, not just security, international. We have a lot of our favorite players, cruising around the coast, and we have to be careful.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today, we're going way up north. We're going up to Greenland, and we're going to be looking at some of the recent events surrounding Greenland and the United States. You've shared some pretty fascinating news clips, and there's statements from former President Trump, Greenlandic and Danish officials. We're even seeing reports of this planned U.S. delegation visit up there. So we're going to really try to unpack all of these events. We're going to look at all the different perspectives, and ultimately, I want to try to figure out what are the key takeaways here for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting mix of information we have to work with here.
Yeah.
And I think having such a variety of sources really helps us understand the different perspectives on this evolving situation.
For sure. Okay, so let's just jump right in. It seems like former President Trump has, again, expressed interest in the U.S. annexing Greenland. He mentioned this to the NATO Secretary General. And he's kind of framing it as something that's necessary for, quote, international security. And this time around, he's saying that this is necessary due to the presence of favorite players. Now, it seems pretty clear he's referring to Chinese and Russian vessels operating near Greenland. And he even went so far as to suggest that NATO might need to get involved. So, I mean, how do we even begin to unpack this? I mean, the idea of the U.S. annexing Greenland is back, and this time it seems to be linked to NATO.
Well, I think what's particularly interesting is the security rationale this time around. I mean, in the past, these discussions seem to focus more on, strategic positioning or maybe economic benefits. But this time, he's directly connecting it to the broader security dynamics in the Arctic. And this is really underscored by, the increased activity that we're seeing of Russia and China in that region. Beyond the obvious shipping routes and strategic positioning, I mean, you also have to think about things like subsurface warfare. As that Arctic ice continues to melt, that region is going to become more and more strategically important. And Greenland really has the potential to be a key player in that, in terms of monitoring and control.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, the reactions from Greenland and Denmark have been, I would say, pretty firm. The outgoing Prime Minister of Greenland posted on Facebook, "Enough is enough." And then he also called Trump's statement inappropriate. So, I mean, that's a pretty clear response.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the Danish Prime Minister, she echoed those sentiments pretty much. She criticized Trump's remarks as being, quote, unacceptable pressure on both Greenland and Denmark. And it's really important to remember here that Denmark's position has been consistent and very clear. Greenland is not for sale.
Right. This is not a new stance at all, is it? I remember this being in the news a few years ago as well.
No, you're absolutely right. They have a very long and established history of asserting their sovereignty over Greenland. And so any suggestion of a sale or an annexation is going to be seen as a pretty direct challenge to that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that keeps coming up in these reports is the strategic importance of Greenland. It's mentioned as being, the shortest route between Europe and North America, which, of course, is historically very important. But also, it's very important for today's world. It also plays this critical role in the U.S. ballistic missile warning system. I mean, that's huge. And, of course, we can't forget about the potential for, mineral resources there. So it's clear that this is more than just about a piece of land, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we connect this to the larger context of geopolitics in the Arctic, I mean, Greenland's location is only becoming more and more significant as that sea ice continues to recede. It's opening up these new routes. It's making the region more accessible. And then you add to that the potential for mining and extracting of valuable resources, and it becomes a pretty compelling target.
Makes perfect sense. Now, what about NATO? What is their perspective on all of this?
The Secretary General seems to be kind of walking on eggshells a little bit. He has stated that Greenland's future is ultimately a matter for the nations of the High North, and he doesn't see NATO getting involved in these discussions. But, he did acknowledge that there is this increasing presence of Chinese and Russian vessels in the Arctic region, and that there is this need for more icebreaker capabilities. So he's not exactly endorsing Trump's proposed solution, but he is acknowledging the security concerns. Right, exactly. NATO is a defensive alliance. And while the Secretary General can certainly recognize that the security landscape in the Arctic is changing, intervening in a potential territorial dispute between two member states, because remember, Greenland is part of Denmark. And so you have the U.S. and Denmark, both NATO members. So for NATO to get involved would be a very divisive move.
Makes sense. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting was how Trump seemed to kind of just dismiss Denmark's historical claim to Greenland. He said that it basically boils down to some, boat landing 200 years ago. And he even implied that, Denmark, quote, really has nothing to do with what ultimately happens there. It seems like a very calculated attempt to delegitimize Denmark's position there.
It certainly does. And I think it really raises this interesting point about how history is understood, how it's interpreted, and how it relates to international law. Denmark's claim to Greenland is not just based on one single event. It's based on, centuries of ties, of governance, of established legal frameworks. And so, to dismiss it so casually is certainly a very bold tactic.
Very bold. Now, what about the people who actually live in Greenland? What is the sentiment among Greenlanders?
Well, according to some of these surveys, most Greenlanders are against joining the United States, but there is a large portion of them who do support independence from Denmark, so it seems like they want more autonomy, but maybe not under U.S. control. Right. And this is really an element that tends to get lost in these big geopolitical discussions. The right to self-determination for the Greenlandic people needs to be a central consideration. They have these aspirations for independence from Denmark, but they're also very clearly opposed to becoming part of the U.S., and that just really highlights their own distinct identity and their own desires for the future. It kind of makes you wonder, is this just about territorial control? Mm-hmm. Or is there something deeper there? Is there a desire to protect their culture, to forge their own path, independent of these major global powers? That's something to think about.
Yeah, great point. Now, in the midst of all of these, annexation talks and rebuttals, a U.S. delegation visit to Greenland was planned. Initially, it was reported that the Second Lady would be part of this delegation, but then it was announced that the Vice President would be joining her. And some sources even mentioned the National Security Advisor and the Energy Secretary. So, this is a pretty high-level group to be sending.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Having such high-ranking officials involved really suggests a deeper level of interest on the part of the U.S. It seems to go beyond just, a simple cultural exchange, especially with people from the National Security Council and the Department of Energy. It raises some questions.
Right. Which brings us to the purpose of this visit. The Second Lady released a video explaining that the trip was just for cultural exchange. They wanted to learn about Greenlandic heritage. They were going to attend a dog sled race that was being sponsored by the U.S. And she also talked about this long history of a mutual respect and cooperation. So that sounds like, pretty standard diplomatic language. However, the outgoing Greenlandic Prime Minister called the visit a, quote, demonstration of power. And the Danish Prime Minister, she made it very clear that this could not be considered a private visit, given that there were official representatives involved. And she also noted that the acting Greenlandic government had actually requested that the visit be postponed because they were in the middle of these government formation negotiations.
Yeah.
So there's quite a difference there in how this visit was being perceived.
Yeah. You're right. There's a pretty stark contrast there between how the U.S. is presenting this visit and how these key figures in Greenland and Denmark are reacting to it. The timing is also interesting. It's happening right in the middle of this political transition in Greenland. And then you've got these high-ranking officials who are involved in things that go way beyond culture. So, it's understandable why people would be questioning the motives here.
Now, Greenlandic MP, she described the planning of this visit as, quote, quite chaotic and disrespectful to Greenland's political processes, especially considering those government negotiations and these upcoming municipal elections that they have. She felt like the U.S. had really misread the mood and that this interest from the U.S. was actually causing more mistrust. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, and it really underlines the importance of respecting diplomatic protocol and, just being aware of the internal political dynamics of other nations, especially when you're dealing with an autonomous region like Greenland. Going ahead with this high-level visit When the acting government is basically asking you to postpone, that can be seen as very disrespectful, and that can definitely hurt the long-term relationship there.
The Danish prime minister also really drove this point home. She said that this so-called private visit with these high-ranking officials at a time when Greenland had said that they didn't want this visit was just unacceptable pressure. And she was very clear that Denmark would stand up to this pressure and that President Trump is, in fact, serious and earnest about wanting Greenland. So it sounds like Denmark is taking this potential threat very, very seriously.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Denmark sees Greenland as a part of their sovereign territory.
Yeah.
And anything that seems to threaten that is going to be seen as a direct challenge to their national integrity. And I think the Prime Minister's very strong words, very clear words, really reflect just how serious they're taking this.
No, the vice president also released a statement. And he indicated that the reason for this visit was partly due to concerns that other countries had threatened Greenland and that they had threatened Greenland's waterways, which could pose a threat to the U.S. and Canada. He said that the U.S. wants to reinvigorate the security of the people of Greenland. And he also said that he believes that both the U.S. and Denmark have ignored Greenland for far too long. So this kind of adds a whole new layer to the story here. It's like the U.S. is now positioning themselves as the protectors of Greenland.
It certainly does. By framing it this way, not just about a cultural exchange, but about security concerns and about this perceived neglect by both the U.S. and Denmark, it almost seems like the vice president is trying to justify the visit and maybe even build support for a stronger U.S. role in Greenland going forward.
Okay, now here's something that really stood out to me. One of the sources mentioned that apparently during the transition period, Trump had said that he would take Greenland by force if he needed to. Now, this was apparently walked back by his transition office. But, I mean, that's a pretty extreme statement, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about relations between allies.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming to hear something like that. And even though they try to walk it back, I think it contributes to that feeling of mistrust, that suspicion around what the U.S. really wants with Greenland. It really makes you wonder about respect for international law and the sovereignty of other nations, especially nations that the U.S. considers allies. I mean, that's not something you hear every day.
Right. So what could possibly be driving all of this renewed interest in Greenland? Well, the commentary seems to suggest a few things. Some have pointed to the real estate aspect, just that, size matters. Others have pointed to the possibility of, huge mineral wealth in Greenland. And then, of course, there's the strategic importance of the Arctic. The U.S. wants to project power there. And one source even mentioned the idea that the U.S. could become a major power source for Greenland to help them with the mining and extraction of these minerals. So it seems like a mix of strategy, economics, and maybe even some personal ambition here.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, the Arctic is becoming more and more strategically important as climate change makes it more accessible. And if you add to that the possibility of extracting valuable resources, I mean, it's easy to see why Greenland would be so attractive. And for a leader who's really focused on projecting power and securing access to resources, it's not surprising that Greenland would be high on their lot of priorities.
Now it seems like the people of Greenland aren't just sitting back and letting all of this happen. There were reports that there was a planned silent protest during the dog sled race. People were going to turn their backs on the U.S. delegation as a way to show their disapproval. I mean, that's a pretty powerful way to make a statement, isn't it?
It really is. It's a very symbolic gesture
Yeah.
that highlights just how strongly people feel about this issue. And I think it's interesting that they chose a silent protest. It's a very powerful way to make their point without resorting to confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that speaks to the culture there as well.
For sure. And then we also have these polls which show that almost 80% of Greenlanders want independence from Denmark. But even more than that are opposed to joining the U.S. So it seems pretty clear what the people of Greenland want, at least for now.
Absolutely. And this is a really crucial point. The will of the people has to be considered in any discussion about the future of Greenland. The fact that they overwhelmingly do not want to be part of the U.S., that's not something that can be ignored.
Right. Now, the last thing I want to touch on here is the whole issue of NATO and defense. Greenland, because it's part of Denmark, is part of NATO. And the U.S. is a key ally in Greenland's defense. So, I mean, it creates this kind of weird situation where the nation that's supposed to be protecting Greenland is now being seen as a potential threat. To make things even more complicated, Denmark reportedly sent 60 police officers to Greenland to increase security ahead of this U.S. visit. That could be seen as a symbolic move. And then the U.S. also sent these two Hercules military aircraft. They arrived and then they left the same day. Some people saw that as a show of force. I mean, it's very unusual to see these kinds of tensions between allies.
Yeah, it is. And it really shows how complicated the balance of power is in the Arctic. You have a situation where one NATO ally is considering actions that could threaten the sovereignty of another member. And I think the movement of troops and equipment, regardless of the reason, it just adds to the tension and the scrutiny surrounding this whole situation.
So as we can see from these various reports, this is a very complicated situation. You have the historical context of Denmark's claim to Greenland. You have these major geopolitical strategies playing out in the Arctic. And you have the very real desires of the people of Greenland themselves. You have Trump wanting to annex Greenland. You have strong opposition from both Greenland and Denmark. You have the strategic importance of Greenland, and then you have this very controversial U.S. delegation visit. It all adds up to a pretty tense situation. And, the idea that a NATO ally might actually try to take territory from another NATO member, that's pretty unusual.
Absolutely. And I think it just goes to show that international relations are constantly changing. And, historical issues and geopolitical ambitions can resurface in ways that nobody expects.
So given Greenland's strategic importance, the potential resources that are there, and all of these different perspectives, what do you think the future holds for Greenland? Will they eventually become independent from Denmark? And if they do, will that lead to them reconsidering their relationship with the U.S.? I mean, right now they don't want to be part of the U.S., but that could change. It makes you think about self-determination. It makes you think about geopolitical interests, and it makes you think about the future of the Arctic. This whole situation is just fascinating.